And Bob Hatfield sends his apologies for not being able to be here today, so I'm sort of, they're very big shoes to fill, but I'm going to be talking more generally about the Workers' History Museum. And I've called this a museum without walls, which aptly describes the Workers' History Museum. But I'll begin with just a few general remarks about the idea behind the panel, and that is about Ottawa, capital city, as a commemorative space. As all of you know, the commemorative landscape of Ottawa has become colonized in recent years by nationalist and decidedly militaristic and overly conservative narratives. Heroes' monuments, small statues and busts of prominent military figures that complement, or I'd argue counters, the non-elite representations of those who fought and served in our National War Memorial, or, for example, the War of 1812 monument, which sort of ticks every box about the myth of that war as a deciding event in the formation of Canadian national identity. One of my students said the only thing missing is a militant beaver. And of course we have the Victims of Communism monument, which any reader of active history knows very much, knows all about because of the wonderful article by Gregor Krenich. But this, of course, in some ways is nothing new. There's a perfect example of the Champlain Monument at Nepean Point and the Anishinaabe Scout, who was known for many decades as Kneeling Indian Tracker. This year he was renamed, or a couple of years ago actually, he was renamed Kichizibi, pardon my pronunciation of this, Amamawini, and he once stood at Champlain's feet looking gorgeously at and respectfully at Champlain, the great explorer, who actually is holding the astrolabe upside down, but that's beside the point. The Anishinaabe Scout is now moved into the bushes at Mayors Hill Park near the bathrooms, and he still looks longingly over at Nepean Point, but he's now he's got at least his own space. When at Carleton we held an international symposium on Champlain in fall of 2013, and we had a lot of Anishinaabe presence at the colloquium, and that site became a site of a spontaneous counter demonstration. We had a beautiful, or what many thought was a beautiful sans lumiere show that was happening at Nepean Point using Champlain as a character. We actually staged a counter protest by the Anishinaabe Scout by showing lots of flashlights and having our own different narrative, which gave him a name, gave him a presence, and gave him a significance that was out with anything to do with Champlain. And you can actually see some of that on one of our students' blogs. Just Google history boots and it will come up. So that was a spontaneous counter-narrative, if you like, to the counter-narrative of the Nepean Point. More recently, a couple of weeks ago, the site of the Victims of Communism monument, proposed site for that, became a site of a demonstration for the victors of Harperism. And that was staged with all of us wearing black and carrying placards. So these are spontaneous, temporary, momentary counter-narratives using some of the monumental spaces in Ottawa as spaces in which you can tell different stories. What I would like to highlight today a little bit is the work of a museum that was founded to tell stories that were also somewhat counter-narrative. They tell the stories that have disappeared in the narratives of the nationalist narratives, the official narratives that we see on Parliament Hill, namely the stories of workers, the stories of the labor movement, the story of the world that was shaped by workers, whether these workers were unionized or not unionized, wherever they were employed, whatever they did, whether they were employed in factories, in shops, or actually in homes. But we are a museum without walls. We don't have a physical space. And that has posed a particular set of challenges for us. I should say I was involved in the predecessor of the Workers' History Museum, and many of my classes did projects with those people involved in the Workers' Heritage Center. We're about to celebrate now, we reformulated as the Workers' History Museum, and we're about to celebrate our 5th anniversary in January. So we've been working together collaboratively for about 5 years within the community. And the loss of a physical place, the absence of a physical space, is something that has been a challenge, but it's also been something that has led us to some very exciting decisions. And so what I wanted to do today is just illustrate some of the work that we're doing, and basically just introduce to some of the the strategies that we've done. We're a very small museum. We're funded by trade unions or by the City of Ottawa, by temporary grants. It's entirely volunteer. And the challenge to telling our story without having a museum has been a very interesting journey. So one of the first things we did was, of course, build a dramatic website. So this is the Workers' History website. We have a running banner which tells different stories and the usual links. One of the most important things that we did very early on was to create a walking tour, which is what Bob was going to lead us through. And the walking tour is one that starts down here by the Rideau Canal, goes around Parliament, can take in other sites from the Parliament, because if you know Ottawa, you know that there's an extraordinary view from here which can tell the story of work and industry and working life across both sides of the river, both in Ottawa and Lower Town, but also over in Gatineau Hall. And the walking tour then comes back to Spark Street and around the central area. So for example, stopping at the canal, we tell stories in the shadow of the War Memorial, in the shadow of the small busts of military generals and leaders and so on. We tell the story of the Rideau Canal being built and the number of workers that died there, the struggle that it took place to create that. At Parliament Hill, we talk about the number of workers who died actually building Parliament. There's lots of monuments to people who passed away, often tragically, often in great service on that hill, but there's no monument to the workers who actually died building Parliament. We tell stories of strikes and labour unrest, and of course the E.B. Eddy site, which I'll come back to in a minute. This is being massively developed now by windmill developers. So the walking tour is something that we conduct. Sometimes some of my students have conducted, sometimes just volunteers from the Workers' History Museum conduct it, but now we're producing this leaflet so that people can do a self-conducted tour. We've done it for union conferences that have been in town. We've done it for the CHA, for the Committee for Labour History, and as you can see, it's fairly well illustrated. So taking it to the streets, telling stories literally by walking the streets, looking at the buildings, challenging the commemorative, nationalist commemorative landscape by just really putting out a different story using the same spaces. We also tell stories. We have prominent storytellers come and for specific events. This is a one-person story about the Alimentière, the women who made matchsticks and suffered enormously from doing so. And it's one event that we do. So storytelling is a spontaneous thing. It happens sometimes in cafes. It happens sometimes in labor halls. It happens sometimes at universities. So it's a matter of trying to repopulate various parts of the city by having different stories and appealing to, drawing in different audiences. With each of our events, with each of these activities, we draw in a different sort of community, a different group within the community. For example, Ottawa storytellers are very well known within Ottawa, and we get that community in. Telling the story of labour history to people who might normally not really have paid much attention to those stories. We also develop very small travelling exhibits. These are very portable, bang them up. This one here simply, flip down, fold, and it's a large briefcase. We can take that anywhere. We take it into schools, we take it into heritage fairs, we take it into universities, we take it to labour conferences, we take it to all sorts of events. And we have about 3 or 4 of these now. This one is actually about Bank Street, Ottawa's Main Street, which Emily is going to talk about in a minute. And as this suggests, it's also, the museum also reaches out and works collaboratively, in this case with the Carleton Centre for Public History and Carleton University. We also make larger ones. One of our very first ones was Family Leave. And this was a story that obviously we found a narrative that was completely forgotten about, that nobody owes organized labor anything, no one, unions are a waste of time. It's a narrative we hear constantly in Parliament, constantly from the Conservative government especially, but we also found it, in normal conversation, everyday conversation with people that, well, why do you need trade unions? What have trade unions given us? What has the labor movement ever given us? We don't need it. And then you point out things like, well, did you just enjoy parental leave, or did you enjoy family leave? Did you enjoy spending time with your children? Do you enjoy healthcare? Do you enjoy those sorts of insurance schemes? Where do you think those came from? Those weren't just given to us by a benign, conservative, liberal, whatever government. These are things that had to be fought for, struggled for, and often with some personal cost. And so Family Leave tells that story, and it's again a traveling exhibit. It zips down and can travel. It's been right around Canada. I won't play this clip because it's not working, but there's also an associated video with that to promote it. Actually, it was a fundraising video, but it included clips of people who had actually fought in those struggles and suffered in their own workplaces by fighting and demanding those sorts of rights. This inspired us to actually move to a third form of history making, which was actually making documentary films. And one of the most recent ones is on Cal Best, who is a diplomat, a very important government, very important in Canadian political figure who had really been ignored completely. And this is a video, it's accompanied also of another portable exhibit, and it's been traveling schools, and school teachers have been using it a lot, and not surprisingly, it's enormously popular and in great demand during Black History Month. But we also, as a museum, we seize opportunities. And what makes it so exciting working with the museum is that we never know what's actually going to come up and what's going to come around the corner. And this is a very delicate discussion going on within the museum at the moment, but one of the things that we're approached to do, that area around the Chaudière Falls that I mentioned, E.B. Eddy's was the matchmaking company there, closed down, sold off by Domtar eventually, and is now a windmill development. What we were invited to do was to capture this extraordinary space, dozens and dozens of buildings, interiors, and systematically we got some volunteer photographers who've gone systematically through every single building, through every single footage of that space. Every square foot is being recorded. We have 36 hours of video. We have 75,000 photographs of this that is going to be touring the country in exhibits. It's going to be a calendar. It's going to be put online, and this is just one of the photographs. So seizing the opportunity, we had 18 months. The museum managed to find about 16, 17 photographers, I think, to come in and just do this systematically. So it's a matter also of being able to be spontaneous, and I'd argue being a museum without walls, we don't put a lot of effort into those day by day, week by week, month by month productions that museums with walls have to face. We can actually afford to drop certain projects and jump on certain opportunities and be very flexible in what we do. And so capturing heritage before it's all torn down and either returned to the Anishinaabe people or turned into condos remains to be seen, but that's the industrial history there. We also are really good at finding spaces. We have a guerrilla movement that basically targets spaces. When we can identify a space that could actually hold an exhibit, we lobby for it. And so there was a development at Britannia Park, which is a leisure area, community center, where the trams used to take working class people out to the beach. We told that story. We did it through a temporary exhibit. We had storytellers tell stories about life there and the entertainment that took place there, but also the growth of capitalism and the exploitation of working people's leisure time by corporations. But the City of Ottawa, we lobbied for a specific space, and we were given part of the community center. So now anyone coming into the community center, whether they're there for pensioners meetings, whether they're there for school meetings, whether they're there just to play with the ants or butterflies or whatever the local teachers brought in from Britannia Beach, we'll see this now as a history of the beach. And I'm involved right now in another one, which is about E.B. Eddy, and we've grabbed a wall in 251 Community Center in Centretown. So anyone going to Octopus Books or any of the meetings there will see a permanent exhibit. A temporary exhibit, it'll be there for 3 years at the moment on E.B. Eddy. So we have this sort of guerrilla movement where if we see a space that might be able to hold an exhibit, we think of the stories that could be told there, and we lobby strongly for it.
David, you've got about maybe 2 minutes.
Okay. And our last project, our most recent project, is on Bank Street, Ottawa's Main Street. And Emma's going to be talking more about this in about 30 seconds. This is a wonderful project that brings together a collaboration between a private company as well as the Workers' History Museum and Carleton University. So What I'd say is what we're trying to do here is repopulate the commemorative landscape. We're not driving forceful counter narratives. We're doing it in a very subtle, a very slow, a very quiet way. But we want to show that we are here, we are present, and working people's experience needs to populate that landscape, and we populate it in different ways, through walking, through virtually, through video exhibits, through small temporary exhibits. And now, as you'll hear in a second, we're taking over the streets.
Super. So at Caitlin's recommendation, I'm just going to sort of roll into the end of David's presentation. So my name is Emily Keys. I am an MA student at Carleton University in the Public History program, and I also work part-time for a historical consulting company called No History. And we were very lucky to be approached by David to sort of come in on this project with the Workers' History Museum and the Carleton Center for Public History on the history of Bank Street. So what I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about today is not so much the logistics of the project, but some of the sites we've been looking at and some of the stories that we're trying to tease out and we're hoping to tease out from each one. So, the sites. So at the moment we've selected 6 sites on Bank Street that highlight the history of the city, the change in businesses, and most importantly, the diverse experiences of workers in Ottawa over time. And this is over sort of a 200-year period. The last business closed in 1997. All the businesses we're looking at are closed, but all the sites that we're looking at are still there. So 5 of the sites we've selected are actually physical, and one of them is actually a route, which I'm going to talk about a little bit today. So I'll just be highlighting 3 of the sites on Bank Street. So one of them is the Handy Shoe Repair, one of them is the Wang Brothers Fruit Store, and the last one, the route I mentioned, is the route taken by Jewish peddlers to peddle goods up along Bank Street and through Ottawa. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Ottawa, this is just a highlight, and you can see sort of the 6 main sites. Bank Street starts sort of right by the Parliament buildings and now goes up, way up. So, the first site I'm going to talk to you about is Handy Shoe Repair. So this was located at 1152 Bank Street in Old Ottawa South. You can see an excellent picture up here, actually put together by someone else who is presenting in another panel right now, Sarah Nixon. And Handy Shoe Repair would have been right where this business is, right there. And while it was there sort of on and off between 1940s and 1950s, there has been a shoe repair and a shoemaker at that site since 1927. So the man who was first there in 1927 and who later came back to the site in the 40s and 50s was named Fred Kostick. We don't actually know much about Mr. Kostick, but we do know that he was Russian, and he is buried at Beechwood Cemetery in Ottawa. It doesn't appear that he had any family living in Ottawa, just from the notation, but he is listed as a retired shoemaker. So we know that he would have been repairing and making shoes at this site. So in between sort of his occupation of the site, there are a number of other owners and people who are coming in and working at the sites. And what's interesting is that they all seem to live either above, below, right next door to the business. And so while we don't know very much about Mr. Kostick, we do know quite a bit about a shoe repair business in Ottawa currently, one of the rare businesses that is still open, run by a man named Edmondo Incanditi. So this is a very young Edmondo. This is his image on his passport when he was immigrating from Italy to Canada in the 1960s. So interestingly, when he arrived here, he worked at a shoe manufacturer and a shoe repair business, also on Bank Street, called Hackett Shoe Repair, down in Centertown. If any of you are familiar with the area, it's very close to Bramisol, the diner right by Bank Street. And the business, unfortunately, is closed, and there is a restaurant in there now called Fauna. So if you're ever in Ottawa and you see it, that's what we're talking about. So after working at Hackett Shoe Repair for a couple of years. He was able to save up and buy his own shoe repair business over in Overbrook, and he has operated that business for 42 years. He's still operating it, and he's very popular in the city. There are people who come in all the way from Petawawa to have their shoes repaired. There were some interviews done by the Workers' History Museum with Mr. Nkandidi and his son, and they really talk about the returning customers who really seem to love coming back to him, coming back to the site, and the quality of work that he does. And so this is a photo of Senior Edmundo Nkandidi, done in 2012 by the Citizen, and these are some of his tools. And what's interesting is because he was trained as a shoe manufacturer in Italy in the 1950s, these tools would be similar to the ones used by Mr. Caustic over at Handy Shoe Repair on Bank Street. So the next site, the next business is the Wang Brothers Fruit Store, and this is a story of the Wang family. So interestingly, while Ottawa never developed a sort of large Chinese community, say as some of the other cities, there is a very early Chinese presence in the city, and many of them owned businesses on Bank Street. So these were cafes, restaurants, and laundries. So like these families, Mr. Xing Wang immigrated to Canada in the 1900s, and he worked with his brother at his uncle's laundromat on Murray Street. And interestingly enough, during our research, we sort of were able to tease out a couple of interesting facts. Usually laundries were most often run by a family. Some people like to joke that they're the most easy workers to get because you know they have to come work with you because they're related to you. But usually you had to save around $500 to $600 to start your own business during the time. And in 1916, there are at least a dozen Chinese identified businesses on Bank Street. So this is Xing Wang's son, Gordon. Gordon took over the business after Xing Wang retired later, but I'll get to that. So Xing Wang eventually accumulated sort of enough wealth to start his own fruit store in the Glebe at 757 Bank Street, if any of you are familiar with the area. Originally it was called Sanitary Fruit Store, and later he changed the name. What's interesting about this family is they had a number of children, but the Chinese community in Ottawa really highlights a number of achievements of his children, including Leslie, who was the first Ottawa-born Chinese Canadian graduate from Queen's University in Kingston. And as a teen, Leslie was the captain of the Chinese Aces, which is a Chinese-Canadian hockey team in Ottawa. This is the team photo, and all of the members were Chinese Canadians. They were from sort of 5 core families that had immigrated, and they all met and practiced together on the Rideau Canal. They have a really unique and interesting story. And so another of Mr. Xing's sons, Gordon, was a coach, and it's Gordon who takes over the business after his father. And like Mr. Edmundo Nkandidi, they operate that business for 60 years, and it closes in 1997. And a lot of the residents of the Glebe recall fondly how lovely the family were, how they would take the time to deliver groceries to the elderly, how they would even put away the groceries and make sure that they were well cared for. So the last site I'm going to talk to you about today isn't a site at all, it's a route. So similar to the Chinese community, there's an early Jewish presence in Ottawa. It's not as large as Montreal or Toronto, but it starts up in about the late 1890s, and it's primarily sort of confined to Lower Town, to the Byward Market, but it soon spreads out over the city. One of the interviews done by the Ottawa Jewish Archives with a former peddler named Lazarus Greenberg essentially explains why so many new Jewish immigrants were attracted to peddling. He explains that if you wanted to observe sort of the customs involved in the culture and in the religion, you had to be a peddler. That was the only way you could really do it at the time. Also, the peddling license was much cheaper in Ottawa compared to Montreal. In Montreal, you were charged $40 for a peddler on foot for a license, $60 if you had a handcart, and $100 if you had a wagon. as opposed to in Ottawa, it was a flat $9 rate for the year. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what peddling is exactly, it involves collecting and selling scrap metal, fruit, cloth, rags, and what you would do is you would take these wares and you would take them around the city to sell to the residents. So returning to Mr. Greenberg, actually, he is one of the peddlers who went up into what's now sort of called the Alta Vista area. At the time it was more known as Billings Bridge. And he is remembered fondly by the residents, also because he ended up starting his own grocery store there called Greenberg's. And he got his license in 1940 and sort of worked his way up from a cart to a bicycle and to a car. And just as a bit of context, these two images, this one is from the 1950s, from 1955, and this one is from 1925.
We've got about 2.5, 3 minutes.
Perfect. Right on schedule. So now I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the app development. So I can't remember if I mentioned this at the beginning. I probably didn't. The goal of the project at the moment is to create a mobile app so that people visiting the city will be able to look at these sites, look at archival material, listen to oral histories, and really sort of get a sense of what it was like to either work at this business, to be a customer at that business, and just the history of the site over time. So while nothing is set in stone, we've been experimenting using a website called MobineCube. What it allows you to do is build an app completely free. The caveat is that you do have to deal with some pesky ads from time to time, but we found it really useful to sort of conceptualize our product. So what we're hoping is that we will have sort of a number of pages. So we'll have sort of the main page explaining a little bit about the project. Users will be able to select whichever site they would like to look at and to look at it on a map. Then by selecting each site, they'll be able to explore different items, photographs, artifacts, whatever they're sort of interested in. And in terms of where we hope the app will go, we're hoping we'll be able to develop some sort of user feedback, whether you can contribute your own story about the site, whether you can suggest sites that you'd like to see sort of coming into the future, and where you can share it. So the next stage of the project at the moment is to start conducting oral history interviews with community residents, former business owners, and former workers to really understand the relationship that is developed between a person and a specific place. Thank you.